The debt collectors came on a Tuesday morning, three men in dark suits standing on the porch of the Reeves family home with papers that would change Talia Reeves's life forever. She was 25 years old, working the register at a hardware store in a town that never seemed to notice her, and she had no idea that her father's failing import business had racked up debts to people who did not forgive and did not forget. Marcus Reeves had always been a proud man, the kind who smiled through hardship and told his daughter everything would work out, but pride did not pay debts owed to the Takahashi organization, one of the most feared syndicates on the West Coast, with roots stretching back to Osaka and branches now spread through every port city that mattered. Talia remembered the sound of her father's voice cracking as he tried to explain years of bad decisions in a single sitting, how a shipment lost at sea had led to a loan, and how that loan had led to another, until the numbers stopped making sense to anyone but the men who now stood collecting on them. She had grown up believing her father was invincible, the kind of man who fixed broken appliances himself and never let a bill go unpaid, and watching him crumble in front of her at the kitchen table felt like watching the floor of her entire childhood give way beneath her feet. When the men in suits explained the terms, Talia sat frozen at the kitchen table while her father wept into his hands, his shoulders shaking in a way she had never witnessed before, not even at her mother's funeral. The debt was 7 figures. The interest had compounded for 3 years. And there was only one way out that did not end in violence: marriage. Ren Takahashi, the head of the family since his own father's death 5 years prior, had apparently taken an interest in resolving the matter through an old-world arrangement, one that would settle the debt entirely and, according to the men delivering the news, guarantee her father's safety for the rest of his life. Talia had never met Ren Takahashi. She had only heard the name whispered in newspapers, always followed by words like ruthless and untouchable, always accompanied by photographs of a man who never seemed to smile in any of them. She looked at her father's broken expression and understood, in that moment, that she had already made her decision, even if no one had asked her opinion at all. That night, she lay awake in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, running through every possible alternative, and finding none that did not end with her father in danger or dead. By morning, she had made peace with what she had to do, though peace was perhaps too gentle a word for the quiet, grim resolve that settled over her instead. The wedding was small, private, and utterly without warmth. It took place in a courthouse with only a handful of witnesses, men in dark suits who watched the proceedings like sentries rather than guests. Talia wore a simple ivory dress she had found secondhand at a shop 2 towns over, the only wedding dress she had ever tried on, and she remembered standing in front of the mirror in the dressing room thinking that she looked like a woman about to attend a funeral rather than a wedding, which in some ways felt true. Ren Takahashi stood beside her in a black suit that fit him with unsettling precision, his long dark hair pulled back, his face carved from something that did not easily show emotion. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered beneath his sleeves in tattoos that told stories Talia did not yet understand, dark ink winding up his forearms in patterns that spoke of tradition and violence in equal measure. When the officiant asked if he took her to be his wife, he said, "I do," in a voice so flat it might have been agreeing to a business contract, which, in every sense that mattered, it was. Talia said her own vows with her chin held high, refusing to let her voice shake, because if there was one thing her mother had taught her before she passed, it was that a woman never let anyone see her fear, especially not the people who caused it. When the ceremony ended, Ren did not kiss her. He simply nodded once, as though a transaction had been completed, and gestured for her to follow him to the car waiting outside, a black sedan with tinted windows and a driver who did not so much as glance at her as she climbed into the back seat. The ride to the mansion was silent, the city giving way slowly to hills and then to a long private road lined with old oak trees, and Talia spent the entire drive staring out the window, memorizing the last ordinary moments of a life that was about to disappear entirely. The Takahashi mansion sat on a bluff overlooking the water, a sprawling estate of stone and dark wood that had clearly once been beautiful and now felt more like a fortress than a home. Servants moved through the halls with quiet efficiency, never quite meeting Talia's eyes, and guards stood at every entrance with the stillness of men who had trained themselves not to blink. Run led her through corridors lined with old portraits and antique weapons mounted on the walls until they reached a narrow staircase at the far end of the east wing, one that spiraled upward into a part of the house that felt forgotten, the air growing noticeably colder with every step. "This will be your room," he said, opening a heavy door that groaned on its hinges. Talia stepped inside and felt her stomach drop. The room was cold, literally, and in every other sense. The wallpaper hung in long strips from water damage. The wooden floor was warped and creaking. There was a single cracked window that let in a thin whistle of wind, and there was no furniture at all except a bare, rusted bed frame shoved against the far wall. Dust hung thick in the stale air, and somewhere in the corner a small stain on the ceiling suggested a leak that had never been properly repaired. "It gets cold at night," Rin said, as though this were simply a fact of the house rather than a cruelty he was choosing to inflict. "There are blankets in the hall closet." Then he turned and left, his footsteps fading down the stairs, and Talia stood alone in the dark, unheated room that was now, apparently, her home. She could have cried. She wanted to, if she was honest with herself. Standing there in a wedding dress she had bought secondhand, in a house that clearly hated her presence, married to a man who looked at her like she was an inconvenience he was obligated to tolerate. But Talia Reeves had grown up watching her mother turn a rundown rental house into a home filled with love using nothing but hard work and stubbornness, patching walls with cardboard when there was no money for proper repair, growing herbs in coffee cans on a windowsill, filling every corner with something bright even when the family had nothing else. And Talia was not about to let a cold room and a colder husband break her on the very first night. She found the blanket closet, pulled out 3 moth-eaten quilts, and made a nest on the bare mattress. She told herself this was temporary. She told herself she would fix this. And somewhere in that resolve, buried beneath the exhaustion and the grief of a day that had upended her entire life, a small flicker of determination took root, the same flicker she recognized from every hard year of her life, the one that had carried her through her mother's death and her father's decline and now, apparently, would have to carry her through this too. The following morning, Talia woke early, the way she always had, stiff from the thin mattress and cold from the draft that had crept through the cracked window all night, and instead of waiting for someone to rescue her from her circumstances, she went looking for the housekeeper. Her name was Michiko, an older woman with sharp eyes and a guarded expression who ran the household with military precision, moving through the mansion's halls like she had memorized every creak in the floor decades ago. "I need supplies," Talia told her simply, standing in the kitchen doorway still in yesterday's dress, because no one had thought to bring her belongings up yet. "Paint, tools, cleaning products. Whatever you can spare." Michiko studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether this new wife was serious or merely posturing, sizing her up the way she might size up a stray animal that had wandered onto the property. Then, without a word, she led Talia to a supply room in the basement stocked with everything a person could need for renovation work, left over from decades of upkeep on a mansion far too large for anyone to maintain fully. "Take what you need," Michiko said. "No one else wants that room anyway." There was something almost like respect in her voice, buried under the gruffness, and Talia decided to take it as a good sign. Before she left the basement, Michiko added, almost as an afterthought, "There's coffee in the kitchen at 6 every morning. You're welcome to it, if you're up." It was a small offering, barely a kindness at all, but Talia clung to it the way a drowning person clings to driftwood. For the first week, Talia worked on her room every spare moment she had. She scraped away the peeling wallpaper with a putty knife until her fingers blistered, and when the blisters healed into calluses, she kept going. She patched the cracks in the plaster with a compound she found in the basement, smoothing each seam until the walls were even again, working late into the evenings by the light of a single bare bulb because she refused to wait for anyone's permission to make the space livable. She scrubbed the warped floorboards until the years of grime lifted away, revealing rich oak beneath that she had not even known was there, hidden under decades of neglect. She was covered in dust and paint by the end of each day, her yellow tank top permanently splattered with white, her jeans stiff with dried plaster. But she did not stop, because for the first time since the debt collectors had shown up on her porch, She felt like she had control over something in her life. In the evenings, when her hands ached too badly to keep working, she would sit on the bare mattress and write letters to her father that she never sent, describing the progress on the room in careful detail, as though narrating the small victories might somehow ease the guilt she still carried on his behalf. Ren noticed, though he said nothing at first. He would pass by the base of the east wing staircase and hear the sound of scraping, sanding, the soft murmur of Talia humming to herself as she worked, and something about it unsettled him, though he could not immediately name why. His own life had been built on control, on precision, on never allowing sentiment to interfere with duty, and the sight of this woman he had married out of necessity pouring herself into a room he had given her almost as punishment did not fit into any framework he understood. He asked Michiko about it once, offhandedly, as though the question did not matter to him at all. "She's still up there, working on that room?" he asked, and Michiko had simply nodded, unwilling to offer more than the facts required. "Every day," she said. "Doesn't complain. Doesn't ask for help unless she needs supplies." Ren had said nothing more, but that night he found himself standing at the base of the staircase for a long moment before turning away, telling himself there was no reason to climb it. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into her project, Ren found himself climbing the narrow staircase for the first time since the day he had shown her the room. He told himself it was simply to check on the state of the house, nothing more, but when he reached the top and pushed open the door, he stopped in the frame, genuinely startled by what he saw. The walls had been painted a warm, soft cream color. The floor gleamed beneath a second-hand rug that must have come from somewhere in the mansion storage. There was a small reading lamp glowing on an upturned crate that served as a nightstand, and Talia sat cross-legged on the bed, now made up with clean linens, stitching a loose button back onto an old cardigan. She looked up when she heard him and did not flinch, did not apologize for being there, simply met his eyes with the same steady composure she had carried since their wedding day. "You didn't need to do any of this," Ren said, his voice quieter than usual. "I know," Talia replied. "I wanted to." He looked around the room again, taking in the transformation, the warmth that had somehow bloomed in a space he had all but abandoned, and something in his chest tightened in a way he did not have a name for. "Why?" he asked, and it was not clear whether he meant "why did you bother" or "why does it matter to you," and Talia answered both. "Because I don't know how to live somewhere that feels dead," she said. "Even if I didn't choose this marriage, I still have to live in it. I'd rather live in something warm." Ren did not respond right away. He simply nodded once, the same small gesture he had given her at the courthouse, though this time it felt different, less like the closing of a transaction and more like the beginning of an understanding. "There's a furniture warehouse the family uses for the estate," he said finally. "I'll have Michiko take you tomorrow. Get whatever you need." It was not an apology, not exactly, but Talia recognized it as the closest thing to one that a man like Ren Takahashi was likely to offer, and she accepted it with a small, genuine smile that seemed to catch him off guard more than anything she had done yet. He lingered a moment longer than necessary before leaving, his eyes moving once more over the fresh paint, the neatly made bed, the small signs of a life being built out of almost nothing, before he finally turned and descended the stairs, leaving Talia to wonder if she had imagined the flicker of something softer in his expression. The following weeks brought changes that surprised everyone in the household, Talia included. She filled her room with second-hand furniture she restored herself, a wooden dresser she sanded and stained until it gleamed, an armchair she reupholstered in deep green fabric she found tucked away in a storage room full of forgotten bolts of cloth, curtains she sewed by hand from fabric she found in the mansion's storage rooms, careful stitches she had learned from her mother years before. She hung small framed photographs of her parents on the wall, and pressed flowers from the garden between glass, and slowly, piece by piece, the coldest room in the mansion became the warmest one in the entire house. She built a small bookshelf from salvaged wood and filled it with paperbacks she found in a forgotten library on the second floor, novels no one else in the house had touched in years. Word of it spread among the staff, quiet murmurs of admiration for the new wife who worked with her hands and never complained, who greeted the guards by name and remembered the housekeeper's birthday, who seemed determined to build a life for herself in a place that had given her every reason to give up. The youngest of the household guards, a quiet man named Toma, who usually kept to himself, began leaving small offerings outside her door, a fresh loaf of bread from the kitchen, a sprig of lavender from the garden, gestures that said more than words ever could about how the household's opinion of her was shifting. Rin found himself drawn to that room more often than he would admit, initially under the guise of checking on renovations, later, without any excuse at all. He would climb the narrow staircase after long days of managing the family's business, days filled with tense negotiations and the constant threat of rival factions circling for weakness, and he would find Talia there, usually reading or sketching or humming softly to herself while she worked on some new project, and the tightness in his chest would ease in a way nothing else seemed to accomplish. "You don't have to sit here all day," he told her once, settling into the doorway rather than fully entering, still keeping some careful distance between them. "I don't sit here all day," Talia said without looking up from the quilt she was stitching. "I have a life, Ren. I just also happen to have a room I like now." There was something teasing in her tone, gentle but pointed, and Rin felt the corner of his mouth twitch in something dangerously close to a smile, an expression few people in his life had ever witnessed. He began bringing small things when he visited, a cup of tea from the kitchen, a book he thought she might like, gestures so small they might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but Talia noticed every one of them and filed them away as evidence that the man beneath the cold exterior was not entirely as unreachable as he pretended to be. Their marriage, born from debt and desperation, began to shift into something neither of them had expected. Ren started joining her for dinner in the small nook she had created near her window rather than eating alone in the formal dining hall as he always had before, the two of them sharing simple meals by candlelight while the household settled into its evening quiet around them. He told her fragments of his past, carefully at first, about his father's death and the weight of inheriting an empire built on violence, about the sleepless nights spent learning to be feared before he had even learned to shave properly, about the loneliness of leadership, about how he had never expected to marry for anything other than obligation. Talia listened without judgment, offering her own history in turn, about her mother's early death, about watching her father's business crumble despite his best efforts, about the quiet ache of being overlooked her whole life by people who saw only her size and never her substance, about the years of being the last one picked and the first one dismissed, and how she had learned to build her own worth out of stubbornness rather than waiting for anyone else to hand it to her. "You're not what I expected," Ren admitted one night, watching her arrange fresh flowers in a chipped vase she had found and repaired. "Neither are you," Talia replied. "I thought you'd be colder." Ron considered this for a long moment, turning his teacup slowly in his hands. "I am cold," he said. "Everywhere except here." It was the closest thing to a confession he had given her, and Talia felt something warm bloom in her chest despite every instinct telling her to guard her heart against a man whose world was built on danger. There were quieter evenings too, ones that mattered just as much as the larger turning points, evenings when Rin simply sat across from her while she mended clothing or sketched ideas for the next corner of the house she wanted to improve, saying very little, content simply to exist in a space that did not demand anything of him. On one such evening, he brought up an old record player he had found forgotten in a storage closet, and together they spent an hour trying to get it working again, laughing quietly at their combined lack of mechanical skill until Talia finally coaxed a scratchy, warm melody out of the old machine, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, simply sat listening to music neither of them recognized, comfortable in a silence that would have been unthinkable between them only weeks before. But danger did not stay confined to metaphor for long. The Takahashi family's business rivals had been watching the marriage with sharp interest, aware that any perceived weakness in Ren's personal life could be exploited. A rival organization led by a man named Hiroshi Sato had long coveted the Takahashi territory along the coast, and when word reached him that Ren had taken an unconventional wife, a woman with no ties to the criminal world and no protection beyond her husband's name, Sato saw an opportunity too tempting to ignore. He began making moves quietly at first, testing the family's defenses, probing for cracks in the perimeter, bribing a low-level guard for information about the household's routines, and then, on a night when Ren was away handling business 2 hours north, Sato's men made their attempt directly at the mansion, cutting the power to the east wing and slipping past the outer gate under cover of darkness. Talia was in her room, now fully transformed into the warmest, most lived-in space in the entire estate, when she heard the commotion below, shouts and the sound of breaking glass, the unmistakable clatter of a struggle happening somewhere in the house. Her heart pounded, but she did not freeze the way she might have months earlier. She had spent the last several weeks learning the mansion inside and out, learning which staircases creaked and which stayed silent, learning the guards by name and the rhythms of the household, and in that moment of crisis, all of that quiet observation became her greatest asset. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the small fireplace she had insisted on having restored, one of the first improvements she had made to the room, and positioned herself behind the door rather than cowering in the corner, refusing to be a victim waiting to be found. Her hand shook, but her mind stayed clear, running through every possible outcome, every possible move, the way she used to plan out chores as a girl when there was too much to do and not enough time to do it in. Two of Sato's men made it up the narrow staircase, weapons drawn, expecting to find a frightened, helpless woman they could use as leverage against Ren. Instead, they found Talia ready and waiting, and when the first man stepped through the doorway, she struck him hard across the arm with the poker, knocking his weapon loose before he could react, her months of manual labor having built more strength in her frame than either intruder had anticipated. The second man lunged for her, but Talia had already anticipated the move, sidestepping toward the window she had reinforced weeks earlier during her renovations. Grabbing the heavy cast-iron doorstop she kept nearby and hurling it directly at his head with an accuracy born of desperation and resolve. He staggered, giving her the opening she needed to slam the heavy oak door, one she herself had rehung with sturdier hinges during her repairs, and jammed the antique wardrobe she had restored against it as a barricade, buying herself precious time while the men on the other side pounded and cursed, unable to force their way through a door reinforced by the very hands they had come to threaten. Downstairs, the household guards were engaged in their own fierce struggle against the remaining intruders, and Michiko, ever resourceful, had already triggered the silent alarm that alerted Ren's men stationed throughout the city. Ren himself received the call within minutes and broke every rule of caution he had ever set for himself, abandoning his meeting and racing back toward the mansion with a fury the likes of which his own men had rarely witnessed, his driver pushing the car well past any reasonable speed while Ren sat in tense silence, his mind consumed entirely by a single fear he had never expected to feel this strongly for anyone. But by the time he arrived, breathless and terrified in a way that startled even him, the threat inside the house had already been largely neutralized, guards subduing Sato's remaining men in the main hall, and when Ren took the stairs 3 at a time toward the east wing, dreading what he might find, he was met instead with the sight of Talia standing in the doorway of her room, poker still gripped tightly in her hand, breathing hard but very much unharmed, the two intruders who had come for her lying groaning on the floor behind her, thoroughly incapacitated. "You're safe," Ren breathed, crossing the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to cup her face, as though he needed to confirm with his own touch that she was truly unharmed. "I'm safe," Talia confirmed, though her voice shook now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade. "I told you I don't know how to live somewhere without fighting for it." Ren let out a breath that was almost a laugh, disbelief and relief and something far deeper tangled together in his expression. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough. "So could you." Riding back here like a madman, Talia shot back, and despite everything, despite the danger that had just passed through their home, they both found themselves laughing, the shared release of terror finally breaking loose, the sound of it echoing strangely through a house that had rarely heard laughter within its walls. In the aftermath, Ren's organization moved swiftly and decisively against Sato, dismantling his operation within days as retaliation for the attack on the family home, the message sent clearly to every rival watching that the Takahashi family's reach had not weakened simply because its leader had taken a wife. But for Ren, The business consequences mattered far less than what the incident had revealed to him about his own heart. He had spent 5 years since his father's death building walls around himself, convincing himself that love was a liability in a world as dangerous as his, and yet here was a woman who had walked into his life, through no choice of her own, and had somehow, through nothing but patience and warmth and quiet strength, become the single thing he was most afraid to lose. He found himself unable to sleep that night, replaying the terror of the drive home over and over, understanding now with total clarity what it would mean to lose her, and understanding just as clearly that he did not intend to let that happen again. He found her in her room the following evening, sitting by the small fireplace, still slightly shaken but composed, mending the sleeve of the cardigan that had been torn during the struggle. "I need to say something," Ren told her, settling into the chair across from her rather than his usual place in the doorway, a small shift that Talia noticed immediately. "When I gave you this room, it was cruel. I told myself it was practical, that the East Wing was simply available, but the truth is I wanted to keep distance between us. I didn't want to feel anything for the woman my family's debts had forced into my life." Talia set down her sewing, giving him her full attention. "And now?" she asked quietly. Ren reached across the space between them and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. "Now I can't imagine this house, or my life, without you in it," he said. "You took the coldest place I own, and made it the only place I actually want to be." Talia felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from something far more overwhelming, the realization that the man she had married out of desperation had somehow become the man she genuinely loved. "I didn't do it for you," she admitted softly. "I did it for me so I could survive this. But I'm glad you get to live in it too." Ren brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, and for the first time since their wedding day, he leaned forward and kissed her properly, softly, as though she were something precious rather than an obligation. In the months that followed, the transformation that had begun in one small room spread throughout the entire mansion. Talia, with Ren's full support and the household's growing affection, began renovating other neglected corners of the estate, turning cold, formal spaces into warm, welcoming rooms filled with life, starting with a sitting room near the garden that had sat unused for over a decade, and ending with a sunlit reading nook off the library that quickly became her favorite place to spend rainy afternoons. The staff, who had once moved through the halls with quiet efficiency and little joy, began to linger longer, drawn to the warmth Talia had cultivated, gathering in the newly renovated kitchen nook for coffee breaks that had never existed under the household's old rhythms. Michiko, who had guarded her emotions as fiercely as she guarded the household, found herself smiling more often, teaching Talia old family recipes in the kitchen on quiet afternoons, passing down knowledge she had never expected to share with anyone outside the family bloodline. Even the guards, hardened men who had seen more violence than most people could imagine, softened slightly around the woman who remembered their birthdays and asked after their families, Toma in particular becoming something like a quiet friend who often lingered near her doorway just to talk about nothing in particular. Ren changed too, in ways his own men noticed with quiet astonishment. The man who had once ruled with cold precision now made time for breakfast with his wife every morning, who once worked through every evening now left his office early to sit with Talia by the fire she had built with her own hands, both literally and figuratively, in every sense of the word. His closest advisors, men who had known him since before his father's death, remarked privately that they had not seen him laugh so freely in years, that something in him had softened without weakening, that if anything he seemed sharper and steadier in his business dealings now that he had something at home worth protecting. Their marriage, which had begun as a transaction to settle a debt, had become something neither of them could have predicted, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, hard-won trust, and a love that had grown slowly, deliberately, the way a fire grows from a single spark into something that warms an entire home. Talia's father, Marcus, visited the mansion for the first time nearly 6 months after the wedding, nervous and uncertain about what he might find, still carrying guilt for the circumstances that had forced his daughter into this marriage. He had rehearsed an apology the entire drive there, certain he would find his daughter diminished, unhappy, trapped in a gilded cage she had entered only to save him. What he found instead was his daughter thriving, glowing with a happiness he had not seen in her since her mother's passing, standing beside a husband who looked at her like she was the center of his entire world. She gave him a tour of the mansion herself, pointing out every room she had touched, the sitting room, the reading nook, and finally her own private sanctuary in the East Wing, and Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the sight of his daughter's handiwork transforming a house that had clearly once been cold into something that finally felt lived in. "I'm sorry," Marcus told her privately, his voice thick with emotion, once they were alone in the garden. "I never wanted this for you." Talia hugged her father tightly. "I know," she said. "But sometimes the things we don't choose end up giving us exactly what we needed. I built something real here, Dad. I'm happy." And watching her stand in the doorway of the room, she had transformed from ruin into warmth, with Ren's hand resting protectively at the small of her back. Marcus finally allowed himself to believe her. As the first anniversary of their wedding approached, Ren surprised Talia with something she never expected. He led her up the familiar narrow staircase to the East Wing, the same path they had walked on that first cold day, and when she stepped into what had once been her private room, she found it transformed once more, expanded now into a full suite, connected to a new section of the house that had been renovated to match every detail of warmth and care she had poured into the original space, but larger, meant not just for her, but for both of them, a true home rather than a room given as an afterthought. There was a second fireplace, larger than the first, and shelves built specifically to hold the growing collection of books she had gathered over the year, and a wide window seat overlooking the water, where she had once only had a single cracked pane letting in the cold. "I wanted us to build the rest of it together," Ren told her, watching her reaction carefully. "Everywhere in this house that used to be cold, I want to fill it the way you filled this room. With you." Talia turned to him, tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by how far they had both come from the two frightened, guarded people who had stood at a courthouse altar a year before. "I love you," she told him, the words easy now, natural, nothing like the careful distance that had once defined them. "I love you too," Ren answered, pulling her close. "I have since the moment I saw what you built out of nothing but stubbornness and hope." Their story became something of a quiet legend within the Takahashi household and beyond, whispered among those who knew the truth of how it began, a marriage born from debt and desperation that grew into one of genuine devotion, proof that even the coldest circumstances could be transformed by patience, hard work, and a heart determined to build something warm no matter what it was given to start with. Talia Reeves, once overlooked, once dismissed, once handed the worst room in a mansion built on fear, had become the woman who warmed an entire house, and the man who loved her most fiercely, and who had once believed himself incapable of feeling anything at all. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more romance stories just like this one, and let us know in the comments what you thought of Talia and Ren's journey. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.